to a Kawasaki KE 175. I'm going to tear into the top end. I'm going to go through and test the charging system on here. Going to do the clutches, remove those, and show you how to go through those, and as well as split the case, get into that crank shaft assembly there and that transmission, show you how the shift mechanism works. So first thing we're going to do is pull the cylinder head off here, and the cylinder jug. We've got the reed valve here with the cage in here. This is the intake boot, and then I'll show you those pedals there. We have got a 12 millimeter head bolts around this cylinder head here. We've got 4 cylinder head bolts, and this head is just going to pop right off then. What you don't want to do is get a crowbar underneath here or a pry bar and peel this head off. Very, very easily break these fins doing that. So all you simply need to do is get your hands underneath there, go ahead and lift that up. These are removable. They're little rubber plugs here that'll actually help spread these fins out, keep them from bending if they get hit for some reason or dinged up from the side. That's what these rubber dampers are in here for. We'll set that aside. Obviously, I'll show you what the top looks like there. There's your dome. You can see there at one time, and most of them are like this, where they've been dinged up a little bit by a piston or particles in there. This one's cleaned up very, very nicely, but you can see those little divots there. Obviously, your spark plug through that center hole there. This is what you call the head gasket here, and it is a gasket, a fairly thick gasket that should be removed and replaced every time you tear into this cylinder head. When you torque those cylinder head bolts down, you actually are smashing this gasket. That's why you want to do it in a cross pattern, but you want to smash that gasket evenly. Make sure that all of them are torqued down the exact same, and then once they're smashed down, obviously you replace it the next time, because you can't smash it down and seal it up just like that again. So set that aside. We're going to go now and pull our cylinder head bolts off. 12 millimeter on there, all 4 of those. And then before we remove that, I'm going to show you what this reed valve assembly looks like here. Those are 10 millimeters. And you typically have an oil line coming up into here, coming from your oil pump over here. You can see that oil line through that boot there. You flip it on this side, same thing. This oil line goes into that boot there. I'm going to set that aside. Then we've got our reed valve here with our pedals here. And this is called a cage, your reed cage, your reed valve there. These open and shut depending on the airflow, the amount of back pressure that you have there. So setting that aside, we're now ready to pull this cylinder off. Cylinder's off there. Check that cylinder wall. Make sure there's no boring or major wear or tear on there. You also want to check it for being in the round position. You don't want it oval there. You want to make sure that those are in good condition. You can re-sleeve these. You can bore these out, or you can just buy a completely different cylinder. So set that aside. Here's our head bolts. You've got a cylinder base gasket here. Again, you want to make sure that that gets replaced every time. You want to make sure this is cleaned up. Take a razor blade, scrape that off of there. To remove the piston there, you grab your pick there, get it underneath of there, and pry this out. I like to keep my finger on top of it, just so it doesn't go flying across the room. Take then from the other side and push this pin out. Okay, and then once you get that piston pin completely pulled out, or pulled out that far at least, you can lift that piston pin up. You will have your wrist pin in there, your bearing here. A lot of times when you order a piston kit, a lot of times this bearing will come along with this pin here. That's if you order an aftermarket piston. If you order a stock piston, you'll have to order all of those pieces separately. So make sure that that gets replaced. They're very, very inexpensive, and they're a common wear problem. Just thing to get replaced every time for the price there. So set that aside. Now we've got our crankshaft here. You can see that it moves freely there. Make sure it doesn't catch. Make sure there's no up and down play or side to side. And once you get that checked out, obviously make sure there's no grooving in here. You want to make sure that all those are working properly. We're actually going to flip this motor up now and tear into this charging system. All right, to tear into the charging system on this Kawasaki KE 100, we've got our side cover here. This is the left-hand side. We've got our countershaft sprocket here. This goes to our rear wheel. This is where our chain goes around here. We've got a front sprocket on there. Typically, we've got that removed. I've showed you a video on how to do that, how to replace that. We had somebody here that had welded this gear shifter on. We have cut that weld. We're going to have to pull this shaft off of here. Obviously, the shifter and the shaft are toast. We're going to get those replaced. We've got a seal in here. This is a fairly common problem because the amount of dirt and debris that gets plowed up in here because of the chain wrapping around here. A lot of times these seals here will need replaced. The nice thing is you can do that when this motor is still in the motorcycle. You don't have to remove it out of the frame to replace that. What you do, take something to remove that seal out. Take the new one, put a little grease around the outside, slide that into position there. Make sure it slides in evenly so you're not getting that seal cockeyed there. And then it needs to be flush with this case here because there's actually going to be a spacer here with your sprocket that's going to slide on there. So that's that. We've got a chain cover that would typically sit here. We've got a sensor here, and I'll tear into that as well while we're doing this. So for now, we're going to lift this gear shifter off. You have splines underneath there. Typically, you'd have a 10mm bolt that runs up from the bottom there and threads into the top part of the gear shifter there. Obviously, this is going to be thrown. And then we've got 2, 4, 6 bolts to remove this left-hand stator cover there. And then underneath your stator cover, we've got your flywheel. Now, this flywheel here looks like somebody's been into it once before, so we're going to do our best to take care of this flywheel. They are expensive, they are fragile. You do need special tools to remove this. So we've got a 7/8 nut, regular thread there. Go ahead and pull that off. We've got a lock washer on there, and then underneath the lock washer we have a regular washer. All right, we've got our special tool here now, and I've got these available for sale if you need them. I'll put a link in the description below. You will need a tool like this to remove this flywheel here. So run these bolts in. They're actually, I would not suggest doing this, but they are the same size as your head bolts. So I guess if you're ordering new parts, you want to use these bolts to run into your flywheel to do this trick, you can, but you will need this tool as well. So run these bolts in. Snug them up. You want to run them in about 1/2 inch at least to get that good enough grip on there so you're not pulling things apart when you go to remove this flywheel. Okay, we've got our puller installed here. We are going to put some pressure on this bolt here. It's going to push against that crank. It's going to pull that flywheel up. Again, just to kind of go over things here, you want to make sure that your bolts here go into your flywheel about 1/2 inch. You want to make sure that your puller is on there straight. So our shaft here is going to be straight every direction so that when you push this bolt in there, when you turn that in, it's going to push straight onto that crankshaft. It's going to pull that flywheel straight off there. So our puller here, again, I do sell these on my store. Check those out, or I'll put a link below. But you do need specific bolts that a lot of times don't come in the kits that you get from your auto body store. So I'll make sure that the kit that I put a link to has the exact bolts that you need. Run this 19mm in here, and what that's going to do is pull against that flywheel here. It's going to pull that flywheel out. So now I have already pulled this flywheel just to speed things up for you, but I see our issue here is going to be our magnets or weights is what some people call them. These are glued on, and they're glued on in a certain area, a certain pattern. You want to make sure that if you're going back together, make sure you get those exactly like your manual tells you to do, and you want to make sure you position those evenly there. The other thing I want to note here, that if we were to run these bolts too far in, you would actually run those bolts so far in that you hit your stator assembly there. So you want to make sure that you don't do that. we'll set that aside now. We can take our puller off of there. We're actually finished with this puller here. We're finished pulling that flywheel. We'll get into that charging system now. All right, now that we have the flywheel off, we can see our stator here. This is our stator impulsor. Some people call them a generator or an alternator. Magneto, there's a handful of different names for them. What this does is create the energy and the power, actually creates a spark so that your motorcycle can run. So without this, you will not have spark on your motorcycle. Now, the issue with this is it probably started up and ran, probably didn't run great. But a lot of times these magnets, just a handful of them are stuck. Maybe there's just a handful of them that are broke off, and it's still creating some spark, just not enough spark to keep that motorcycle running, or it just won't start at all, just have some weak spark because of the gaps in between here. So it's not creating a steady enough flow of power to get that motorcycle started. So the other thing that you can do on these, and I've loosened up a couple of these screws here, are you can advance and retard this. So you can see there's a little bit of a slot here underneath this screw and this screw here. You can take and shift that a little bit to advance it if it needs to. So we've got 2 screws that hold this stator, this plate on here, and this entire plate will come out of here. Now that I have those screws off of there, you can see there's some wiggle room in each of those spots there. So the other thing, you've got a wire going to your sensor here. You'll have to undo that small Phillips screw. We won't take that off all the way. Take and slide that out. Now we can take and make sure that we pull up this grommet as well so that that isn't sticking into place there. Now going back together, you want to make sure that this seats properly, seals up like it should. A lot of times people will put a little bit of liquid gasket maker around that edge there just to make sure that it seals up properly. So that's the stator plate there. The stator assembly is this entire assembly. Now, if you were to go and order this from Kawasaki, most of the time they would sell it a plate, this piece and this piece separately. So it'd be 3 separate pieces here. Sometimes you can buy it as a set. If you buy them aftermarket, a lot of times they come with a set. Just check out my videos on buying some of these aftermarket parts and some of these knockoff parts. So check those out. Make sure you're buying high quality stuff there. Underneath of the stator assembly, we've got a woodruff key that's here. It's a little keeper. It's a little half moon shape. That goes into your crankshaft. That's also going to go into your flywheel there. Keep that flywheel from turning. Otherwise, if you forget to put that in there, or it doesn't get put in there properly, or it breaks off, sometimes they break off, that flywheel is going to spin with your crankshaft. You can see there our crankshaft is tapered there. So if that loosens up and that keeper comes out of there, that flywheel can just loosen up and spin on there. There's nothing else that holds that from spinning. So that bolt that tightens this down is only going to do so much work there with the amount of times that this is spinning and the force that it has. To remove this sensor here, we've got 2 more screws that we need to remove. And this is going to fit right over top of your shift drum. So when we split this crankcase, you'll see our shift drum is right in behind there. You've got a little pin there. At some point that'll stop spinning. You can get to your P3 is my impact here, and then slide that on there. That's the correct size for this. Take a hammer, loosen this up. Now you do want to make sure that you spin it all the way till it stops. Otherwise, when you take and slam on it just like that, it's going to spin into place. You could potentially break some of those shift forks. So take and spin that off. I'm going to keep all of this together. You can see there we've got a sensor lead there. This is kind of, we'll put